Welcome to the podcast on Exponential Talent. I'm your host, Sarkar-Barney. In this podcast series, I cover talent practices that have a multiplier effect. There are a lot of ideas on how to be a better leader, how to drive business impact through talent, or simply how to be happy. What if we could cut through the noise and find just those practices that can produce 10x the results? That's exactly the kind of information we plan on covering. Timely, relevant, evidence-based, and actionable. If that excites you, continue listening, and please help us spread the word about this podcast. Hello, listeners. This podcast is on the topic of HR analytics. Our guest today is Dr. Alec Levenson from the Center for Effective Organizations at the University of Southern California. He will discuss with us why organizations struggle to derive value from their HR analytics efforts. Alec and I met earlier this year at a panel hosted by the founder of COSI, the Community for Organizational Sciences in India, Dr. Arti Shyamsundar. The panel itself was a great format. It was comprised of a multidisciplinary team, and we were each given a business scenario and asked to present a solution. So you could see how people from different disciplines actually addressed the business case. Alec's approach struck me as being comprehensive, yet very practical. I had a chance to catch up with him a few times since that panel, and in the process realized why organizations fail to get benefits from their analytics effort. In this podcast, we dive into those issues so you can do the few things that produce the most value. Be sure to check out the links to his book and his blogs on strategic analytics. Hope you enjoyed this podcast. Well, Alec, I am really excited to have you in our podcast. A few months ago, you and I were in a panel interview and on organizational science. Some of it involved using analytics. And I found myself nodding my head a lot, saying, I completely agree, and I wish more people could hear your point of view. And your blogs, I have a very similar response. I say, I read it and I say, I wish more people were reading your ideas because they would be making fewer mistakes. They would be getting better results. So all of that has culminated into our conversation today. I'm really excited. I've had a chance to get a sneak peek at some of your thoughts around the questions that I have. So let's just dive into our very first question, which is around what is the difference between HR analytics, talent or people analytics, and workforce analytics? I see all of these used in the people practice today, but is there really a difference, or are they referring to the same thing?
So I'd say there are some slight differences among them, but more important is the difference between those and two other really big categories. So I want to put those groups of analytics in the middle, and on one side of it, I want to put data science, which today, if you were to say those words, if you say HR analytics, people analytics, talent analytics, workforce analytics, if you were to say that to people, they're going to spit back to you the two words data science, because that is like the hot area right now. Everybody's talking about data science. It's probably the hottest field in analytics, for probably a generation. But there's an important difference between data science and those types of analytics. There's also another important difference between those types of analytics and what I'm going to call organization science, which is where you and I come from. Whether it's economics or psychology or sociology, there are these kind of, I'm going to call them much richer way of looking at things that come from a more disciplinary-based approach, where those more disciplinary-based approaches are an important part of what's missing from the field of HR analytics today. But let me without taking our whole time, let's talk a little bit about each of those three different buckets, because I think it's important to set things straight for the listener. So first of all, data science is just that. Data science is about data. And there are really important things that you should need to know if you're going to kind of roll up your sleeves and want to get your hands dirty with data. And a lot of it's basics, but also can be fairly sophisticated and difficult to do. So I don't want to at all belittle our colleagues in data science. It's a very important field. But data science is literally just about data. It actually doesn't teach you about about the people side of data. And so a very important difference between data science versus workforce analytics, talent, people, whatever you want to call that, the other bucket, is that the data scientists literally don't know enough about the people side of things to be able to avoid making a lot of the mistakes that we already know about. And so when we talk about, what's important for organizations, if we're talking about mining consumer data to be able to look for general patterns and things, then a data scientist can do a decent job. But even then, I want somebody who is an expert in marketing and consumer behavior to be driving the work of the data scientist, because otherwise they're kind of like a toolkit without an expert craftsman or craftswoman to be able to guide the use of the tool. That's what a data scientist is like. At the other end of the spectrum are the people like us who were, crazy enough to go to school for, ridiculous amounts of time and get all this extra education, which was probably, not very useful. Also we could come in and then focus on some fairly basic questions which are important about people and organizations. And I think that we can go a lot into this during our conversation, but so there's a lot of knowledge that comes out of the organizational sciences that is important for things like, if you're doing validated testing, if you want to understand get deep into people's psyches, which is a really important foundation for understanding what makes people tick, what makes them motivated. And a lot of that is missing from what we'll call the original bucket of the HR analytics. And in the HR analytics bucket, we have, I'd say, kind of a mishmash. There's not necessarily a real discipline there. HR analytics in some ways is a call to arms for people to be building within the HR function in businesses these capabilities that used to exist only outside. So 2 or 3 generations ago, you might have some IO psychologists and other statistically trained people working in an HR function, but there wasn't this mandate around, you should have an actual HR analytics kind of expertise sitting in the HR function. And so in some ways, what HR analytics or talent analytics is today is it's one part a call for discipline and insights. So saying that we want to get to better database decision making in HR and around people, but it's also a more practical thing of saying that if this expertise is needed, then we shouldn't have to always go to outside consultants. There's an argument for why we should be building it internally, but the business case doesn't always start from what's the actual kind of knowledge disciplines we need to build the function. And I think that's actually part of the problem with the disconnect between kind of where HR analytics is today versus where it needs to be going. And that's more towards organizational science.
It's really interesting, your point about data science and why it's not enough to have just that expertise of how do you handle data is so important. And just to provide an example to what you shared, not too long ago, there was a SHRM publication. It was actually a company, they were reporting on some company data, and I can't remember the name of the organization, but the article was about how they found that focusing on emotional intelligence or emotional intelligence training accounted for 57% improvements in leadership effectiveness. Now, most people get really excited about that, but this is exactly why it's important to not just have your data scientists write up your reports. There is no prior evidence to show that emotional intelligence can account for that much of variance. In fact, there is no variable under the sun, a single variable that can account for that much variance in any outcome. This is just how the behavioral sciences work. And not having the expertise to make sense of the data can lead companies to actually come to the wrong conclusion.
Yeah, exactly. And the funny thing, the great thing about that example, which I love that you brought that up, is that if you ask a data scientist to explain the difference between correlation and causation, they'll be able to tell you a perfect textbook definition. But in fact, the biggest problem is that data scientists aren't trained with enough of the theory. Again, whether it's consumer theory or human behavior theory, whatever it is, there's lots of theories and those theories are not just, it's not just theoretical. It's not just people, people didn't just think this up and say, oh, I'm going to, impose this on society. We're talking about the development over decades or even a century or longer of deep systems of thought and evidence and testing and then validation to understand, well, why does somebody, buy peanut butter and jelly together? Why is it that if you actually treat people better in organizations, you can get to better commitment and better performance? I mean, these are like foundational, and yet, even in my case, so, I'm kind of like this interloper. So I got an economics PhD, and I learned a lot about external labor markets, which is really important. So I've got that expertise that I bring in, and so I understand about kind of how external labor markets work and pricing and all that. But when it came to the internal workings in organizations, I almost had to get a whole nother PhD on the job to learn organization behavior, to learn the psychology side of things. And even then, I'm not an expert in engineering. I'm not an expert in consumer behavior, right? So when we're talking about analytics of what goes on in organizations, and whether we want to understand the external view of what's going on with the customer or the internal view of what's going on with the employee, there's enormous amounts of knowledge that no one person alone can do by themselves.
Right.
And a data scientist is kind of like the worst, reductionist example of they're a toolkit without that discipline to guide it. And again, I know lots of really good data scientists. I'm not saying that they have, that they're worthless, but what I am saying is that they can be one part of a larger puzzle. But particularly if we're talking about building an HR analytics function within a group, I'd only want to get a pure data scientist after I've brought in a lot of other kinds of expertise. And if there's a large enough volume of work, that we'd only want a pure data scientist working on it.
That makes a lot of sense. So in simple terms, could you help define what is HR analytics, just so we are all, on the same page?
So that's a great question. I don't even know if I have a really good definition. So I'll propose one, and maybe, in the course of this conversation will evolve, and I'm happy to have people give feedback. We can figure it out. I think this is actually part of the problem. In some ways, HR analytics today is kind of like, the scene where you've got a bunch of, blindfolded people touching the different parts of an elephant. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're oftentimes talking about different parts of the elephant when we really mean the larger thing. So if I took a shot at it, I'd say HR analytics is about doing rigorous assessment of what are the drivers of human behavior and performance in an organization, which is probably a more broad definition than even most people might give to HR analytics, but I think that's actually part of the problem. So I think there's a difference between what HR analytics is today in many organizations versus what it needs to be. What I just described is what it needs to be. It needs to be about how can you actually address the important questions about what drives behavior and performance in an organization, but the ability to do that is not where the vast majority of HR analytics practice is today.
I'd agree. And so I wrote down a few, what you just said. HR analytics is about using data and insights. I'm paraphrasing a bit. Data and insights about what drives behavior and performance in the workplace. And might I add that HR analytics is about helping drive value creation through human capital. Now that's even broader, but then maybe we shouldn't even call it HR analytics. I think what companies are looking to do, a strategic CHRO is likely to say, yes, we want to be able to contribute to value creation through people and give organizations the best insight. And if that's what their goal is, I think what they should rebrand their HR analytics practice as to be an evidence-based HR practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And not to make the conversation even more complicated, but I want to be even careful to use the words evidence-based because, and this is now more a comment for the kind of the researchers in the audience, there is a very big move towards evidence-based HR, which comes out of the same kind of move as evidence-based medicine. And I'm all for it. Okay, so evidence-based HR is about, for example, if we know that there are certain ways to screen people, and we know that interviews are really, really poor at telling us anything, then evidence-based HR says you stop relying on interviews the way you are right now. That's one example. And there's lots of others, like use 360-degree feedback, right? So we know that 360-degree feedback, 360-degree rating. If you use 360 ratings for feedback purposes, they can be very valuable. But if you start to use them for performance management, then they can lose most of their value because people then alter how they respond.
Right.
So those are two examples of evidence-based management. The challenge, though, and this is where I spend a lot of my time, even helping to try to kind of educate and change the direction of a lot of even advanced HR analytics groups, is that when we say evidence-based, that means there's been a large amount of social science research that has been applied to a particular topic, and it comes up with something that's a truth. And that means that it has to be something that applies pretty much across all organizations and all settings. And so things like, recruiting practices, or how you use 360-degree ratings, how you do performance management, performance feedback. I mean, those are all kind of universal truths, and there's some important evidence that comes out of research from that. But the problem that HR functions face is that those are table stakes. I mean, those are like the bare minimum of what you should do in order to be doing kind of reasonable HR practice. It's kind of like saying what's the bare minimum what someone should do as a first-line supervisor. But the deep insights that you need, to your point, you mentioned, essentially driving customer value. I mean, we essentially there's two economic values the corporation, the enterprise is supposed to create, and one is shareholder value, and the other is customer value. Mm-hmm. And the two of those go hand in hand. And then arguably there's a third one, which is employee value. And HR analytics is about understanding that we need to create the right kind of employee value proposition, which is the right mix of performance expectations and accountability and opportunities for development and rewards and feedback. And it's the whole thing. It's essentially how we engage people, how we get them to want to be productive for us, but it's not in a vacuum. It's not just what kind of an experience we create for employees. It's how does the experience we create for employees enable us to then execute the strategy, enable us to create the shareholder value and the customer value, which then gives us the profit we can actually pay people, according to the employee value proposition.
I think you make a really good point. Some of the things, though, that you call table stakes that comes from evidence-based practice, unfortunately, is not stable table stakes, even in well-established large corporations. Simple things like, for example, hiring practices or recruiting practices. One of the assessment techniques that we know provides the most information about who has the ability to perform the job is work samples. Very, very few companies actually use work samples to hire their employees. I mean, predominantly, the predominant practice in business is to use unstructured job interviews, which we know it's among one of the lowest predictors of future job performance. So my perspective, not to belabor the point here, but I think what companies, for what they're trying to do, they'd be better off using a combination of prior evidence and analytics of their own data to determine what should they do and what's working, to answer those two questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me add on to that I think part of the challenge we're talking about here is that, to your point, there's a lot of learning that companies need to do, a lot of improvement in practice around some of those, kind of tried and true principles, like you said, like, realistic job previews. So some of that is just kind of knowing what the evidence says and then going and figuring out the right way to do it. But even to figure out the right way to do it can be complicated.
Agreed.
So there's important analytics you can apply to that. You could spend all of your time. So let's talk about like the Fortune 200, Global 200 size companies that have huge budgets and have the ability to create large HR analytics teams. You can create enormously large teams, and you would have tons of things that you can go after. A lot of low-hanging fruit and even some less low-hanging fruit around improving HR practices like that. But if you spend all of your time focusing on those, and don't get me wrong, every time you can improve an HR practice like that, you are positively contributing to the organization, and perhaps in very meaningful ways. One of the reasons why I wrote my book, Strategic Analytics, which in reality is better called kind of org diagnostics than analytics, because it speaks to the challenge that you have to take a both-and approach. So we have to think about where is it that we can be incrementally improving HR practice around recruiting, around performance management, things like that. That's kind of, you need to do that. But at the same time, the really big questions around what do we need to know to overcome the barriers to improve strategy execution? Kind of what are the things that are keeping your line leaders up at night? Those kind of evidence-based HR approaches, that's not what's keeping the vast majority of your line leaders up at night, right? They're trying to solve much bigger performance questions, where those performance questions, people are always a key element of it. And so the answer is right now, there's too much of the business will do a whole bunch of analysis and come to conclusions and make recommendations. And then they'll turn it over to HR and say, HR, well, you only get to play in the space of kind of the people side of it, as if you can actually analyze kind of business operations and the people operations separately from each other, when in fact, they're so tightly integrated, you can't separate them out. And so that to me is the big problem, is that we need to have a much more integrated team-based approach to doing both business analytics and HR analytics, and that's not what we have today in almost any organization.
So let's take stock of how are companies doing today with the approaches that they're using, perhaps, the narrow approach of looking at what the practices that are within the control of HR. Do you think anybody's seeing significant results from their HR analytics efforts?
There is, but it tends to be on more of a case-by-case basis than saying that, I can't look at one company and say everything they're doing is having, amazing return. But it really speaks to, if you have done the initial foundational analysis first, and by that I mean the business and HR coming together. So if you really understand what is our business model, how is it that we make money, and where is it that we've got barriers to improving performance, and then you're focusing on those. If you've done those steps first, and then you come down and you say, okay, now we've got a very specific, kind of maybe a quote unquote narrow HR topic. If that narrow HR topic was identified by going through the process of the business steps first, then that's fine. I'll give you a really good example. So companies that we've done a lot of work with are like business services companies or accounting firms, so, firms like PwC, Deloitte, E&Y. So in their model, their delivery is people. I mean, they're delivering things like accounting services, tax advice, and things like that. But ultimately, it happens through people, and they have a very, very kind of structured process for how they bring people in. They've got a very clear, path where you become a partner after many, many years, but only a small number of people become partner, which then leads you then having a very kind of steep pyramid structure where you've got a small number of people at the top, a layer that's slightly larger below them, and so on as you go all the way down. When that's your model, when you know that the model is we're a partnership structure, and we need to have so many people at the first layer, then so many people at the second layer, they actually have it calculated down almost to a science, where kind of the ratio of the sizes of each layer of the pyramid needs to be almost exactly defined by the I don't know what the exact number is, but they need turnover around something like between 17 and let's say 20%. Going from one level to the next in order to have that right kind of ratio of people. If you have turnover that's too low, then what happens is too many people get pushed up to the pyramid, and then you can have kind of too many people sitting there waiting to become partner, which can be very frustrating for them. And also, you may even have too many people at the higher levels, because when we're talking about how you structure an audit when you're doing that work for a client, there's a lot of the kind of more simple work that may be done by your entry-level people or your one through, kind of second level. But then there's a lot of higher order stuff, which is done by the managers and the senior managers. And so over time, they've evolved these very sophisticated strategies, which it's not just about a partnership structure, but they figured out how to have a partnership structure with a specific kind of pyramid of people, and then tasks assigned to people at each level of that pyramid, so that when they're done, they can actually say, we need to have turnover between like 17 and 20% to make the model work. And so when they've already done that analysis, now if you go to turnover and you say, oh, well, turnover is only 5% at one of these levels, they can immediately go, okay, that's too low. Or if they say turnover is 30%, they can say it's too high. And in that narrow example, we can then say that their objective should be to figure out how to either increase or decrease turnover to get it to that right amount. But I only was able to say what the right amount of turnover was because I understand the business model, and how each of those roles fit into the business model and why they have a very specific amount of turnover they're targeting. But that is the exception that proves the rule. There's almost no other HR metric that is out there where I can look at that metric and say, oh, I know what to do, independent of the business context.
So it's a really interesting example, because you're not saying that that turnover metric is what's helping them make that model work. What he's saying is, because they have a model and they know how that model creates value in the organization, to keep that model working, they have to pay attention to turnover.
Exactly.
So it's more of a deductive approach.
Right. Well, and there's other things they have to pay attention to as well. So in order to be able to deliver against their, the audits they provide and the tax services they provide, they have to make sure that at each step people are developing enough so they have the skills they can go to the next level.
Right.
And so they have to be very purposeful about that. So it's not just about letting people, when they do this really well, they actually treat their client service staff as assets that have to get developed, so that even if someone might not be an A player, to have these firms work really well, they have to take not just the A players but also the B players and say, those guys and gals are going to be a key part of our delivery model, as they move up the hierarchy. And so we have to make sure they get the kind of developmental experiences they need, even if they aren't the top people, which by the way is a very different approach to development than you get in most organizations, because in most organizations it isn't this expectation that you will proceed to the next level or you leave, right? I mean, you could actually plateau. If you want to become a first-line supervisor and you want to spend the rest of your career there, a lot of companies are happy with that. And that's not to say that the accounting firm's model is right or wrong, and every other company's model is right or wrong. In fact, for the context, for the way they design their system in the accounting firms, they need to make sure that everybody gets developed because they are supposed to go to the next level. Whereas outside of that kind of partnership structure where it's not an up or out, then it's fine for some people to focus on developing and moving up the ladder, because you don't necessarily want everyone to be that way. I mean, they basically designed very different kinds of systems in those two different cases.
So what you're saying is context is important.
Yeah, it's not just important. Context is king and queen and duke and duchess and all the royal children.
I like that. So let me ask you my next question, and this one has to do more with method. So in one of your blogs, you write about the fallacy of data mining and simple modeling, like overemphasizing on these techniques. You say that organizations in every corner of the world are committing this fallacy. So explain to our audience, what are you referring to by this fallacy, and why is it a concern? Why should companies be concerned about this?
Well, so first of all, data mining in its most pure form is literally that. You are just doing, the actual term within math is called linear programming, and you take a computer. Once upon a time, this was done much more manually, but it was still linear programming back then. You had to create these fairly sophisticated programs that then essentially they're looking for relationships in the data. Now, if we're talking about a brand new type of activity, like let's say we're talking about when the internet was just created, or social media. So when social media really started to take off, and all of a sudden we had people who were generating enormous amounts of data in unstructured ways that we kind of weren't familiar with. When we first start to learn about that new kind of data, then data mining is perfectly fine, because there may be some interesting correlations that we're not aware of, and those correlations can then kind of point us in the direction of questions we want to answer. Now, the thing is, if we think back to, and I'm going to hopefully not bring back some bad memories from your grad school days, Shreya, but most of us, whether you've done an undergraduate thesis or a master's dissertation or, heaven forbid, a PhD, which is way too much effort, there's one of the first things that we're taught is that data mining is a really bad idea, because you can find lots of what look to be really interesting correlations that are just meaningless.
Spurious correlation.
Yes, spurious correlation. Yeah.
Right. Decimal empiricism.
Yeah, no, and in fact, for anybody who's listening, if you haven't seen it, you probably have seen some examples, but if you go onto the internet and look up spurious correlation, there's a marvelous book that is full of like 150 spurious correlations, each of them with a graph. and it shows exactly what, and it's things like, like number of Nicolas Cage movies, and number of times people fall into a bathtub and kill themselves. I mean, and the correlations are so strong that if you just look at the data series, you're like, well, of course they're related to each other, but they're actually not. Now, when I say examples like that, that's what you could say, well, of course not. But let me give you some more kind of real world examples. So a while ago, the story has it that Walmart, which has always been kind of prided themselves on having really good data analysis. And when you've got that many purchases that are taking place by millions of people and tens of millions of transactions, there's an argument for taking that unstructured data and trying to learn from it. Well, so apparently they did a very big kind of machine learning type of analysis, and they came up with the insight that when you in hurricane country, like in Florida, when a hurricane is coming, you should put Pop-Tarts at the front of the store. For those of you who don't know Pop-Tarts, these are these wonderfully seal-packed, kind of hermetically sealed things that you should put in a toaster. But even if you don't have any electricity, you could eat them fresh, fresh out of the bag. Well, so they did a really, really in-depth, kind of potentially expensive, at least in terms of computing time analysis. If you went walking into the store, if you went walking into any assistant store manager at Walmart in hurricane country in Florida, and you said, hey, what kind of product are you putting to the front of the store? Any one of them who's worth their salt would say Pop-Tarts, because they know that what happens is when a hurricane is coming, people want to go and buy food that they won't have to be able to cook to be able to eat. And Pop-Tarts is just one example of that. Now, I'm not saying that, that Walmart is always doing that kind of simplistic analysis they should have done anyway, but that's a perfect example of data mining without going to theory first.
Interesting. So, yeah. I would have thought that they would have stocked up on water.
Well, there's that too, right? But apparently Pop-Tarts was the insight. Now maybe that was the insight, is that a lot of store managers, maybe were getting the water and things like that and didn't think about Pop-Tarts. So again, I'm not saying there was no information in that analysis, but it's a good example that like what you can learn from that, that's very different than the ability, for example, to figure out, what features should go into the next iPhone. Because the features that go into the next iPhone are not based on necessarily existing data. It's based on anticipating what people are going to want that they might not even know yet. And the problem with data mining in general is that data mining can only tell us about past patterns of behavior, can't necessarily tell us about causation, and it doesn't necessarily focus us on what matters most.
So your advice is, if you're a CHRO and you're thinking about building or expanding your HR analytics team, don't start with data mining.
Right. Don't start with data mining, which also then has direct implications to the kinds of people you want to hire.
Right.
So the first person I want to hire is somebody who has business consulting skills, somebody who actually understands the business and can talk to the business and help to define the right questions. I don't even want to start, much as I love, promoting people like you and me with PhDs. I don't want a narrow IO psych or occupational psychologist PhD who can't speak the language of the business or doesn't have the consulting skills. Now, many of us do, and that's fine. But if I had to choose between, a PhD in IO psych who's very narrow and just focuses on validation, or somebody who is more of a general business consultant, I want the business consultant first. You can then hire a more narrow IO psych person, but then the IO psych person needs to be kind of, answering to the business consultant, because they're the ones who are going to really know where to focus the analytics group's attention on.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I know that a lot of people think that IO psychologists just do validation. We get trained to do a lot more than that. A lot of us do spend quite a bit of time learning about business as well. So no hard feelings there, but I just want to let the community know that IO psychologists are pretty broad.
Oh, absolutely. No, and let me just say that I have learned more about business from my IO psychologist friends, because, again, this brings me back to the importance of understanding employee motivation and behavior and how that fits into a larger context. And that's where I think when IO psychology is done really well, that's when I see it applied, extremely well. I've been disappointed sometimes that though it's some IO psychologists who are more narrow, but I'm definitely not writing off the field. I was just I was making perhaps a stark contrast between a very narrow IO psychologist, which again is not necessarily the norm, versus somebody who's a broader thinker.
Well, and it's a good, a conversation for another day, because I do think you're making a good point. For us as a field, as IO psychology, we by ourselves are not as useful. But when we combine our skills, let's say with economists, with business, with MBAs, our skills get amplified. And therefore, we have to be the bridges between these different disciplines as well. And I think that's where the field needs to be heading. But conversation for another day.
Indeed.
You're listening to the Exponential Talent Podcast on HR Analytics. Our guest today is Dr. Alec Levenson from the Center for Effective Organizations at the University of Southern California. So let me ask you this question, following up from, we just talked about specific methods, but in general, you and many other experts have lamented that HR analytics relies more on counting what can be counted versus measuring what matters. In your view, what are those important questions that HR analytics teams should be focusing on, and how should they go about answering that with their data?
Yeah, so measuring what matters is one of the most important things. That's one of the most challenging. I mean, my colleague John Boudreau has talked a lot about this in terms of hitting the wall with HR measurement. I talk about it in my book in terms of making sure you're answering the big questions. And I think there's a two-part critique. One is that the data that's sitting in your systems right now is where it's a natural tendency to always go for that data. I mean, it's sitting there, so therefore you should be able to learn something from it. And there's a very powerful rationale behind that. And that's because on the business side of things, benchmarking and understanding how we measure things is how we know whether or not the business is actually succeeding, whether it's around manufacturing output, quality, go-to-market efficiency, customer service, all of those metrics that we use to determine are we creating the right customer value for the client, that's how the business lives and dies, is on the basis of that kind of measurement and benchmarking. And so when we come to the people side of things, there's a very natural tendency, particularly amongst business leaders, to say, well, just tell me the benchmarks I need. I mean, Kaplan and Norton created this amazing thing called the balanced scorecard years ago, and even in their own book, so they wrote one balanced scorecard book and they wrote another one about 10 years later. And the second one, they actually admit there that the people quadrant of the balanced scorecard is totally not lived up to its potential. They were writing this like 20 years ago at this point, and it still is in the same place. Because in a balanced scorecard, in any kind of a scorecard, you have to put in measures of essentially what's sitting in your system right now. But the vast majority of information you need to answer those important business questions and what you need to know about people, it doesn't exist in the kind of form of data that can go into a scorecard like that. It can't be measured consistently, accurately, reliably, and efficiently. That's an acronym called CARE, which I use in my book. So part of the problem is that they go to the data in their systems because that's what makes sense. The yin to the yang, the other part of the problem here is that where they need to be going is, first of all, either collecting data that doesn't exist yet through additional surveys or however you're going to get there, or even as important, if not more important, you talk to people and you do qualitative analysis. And this is, in many ways, kind of totally counter to what many people think of when they talk about HR analytics, because, well, analytics is about analyzing data, right? I mean, it has to be, there's some kind of statistical element to it. And yet, if you think about it, some of the most important analysis that happens in business is done by the strategy consultants and by senior executives, where they look at the entire organization, they say, we have sales targets, or we have, market share targets, or, whatever it is, margins. And when we're not hitting those, the task then is to diagnose, why aren't we hitting those targets? Well, I mean, let me put on a little bit of a statistical hat for a second. I mean, in statistics, there is this thing called the law of large numbers, which basically says that you need to have a minimum number of observations of something to actually run a statistical analysis. And even for the people who are listening, in fact, especially for the people who are listening who don't have a statistical background, just kind of stay with me for a minute here. What this means is that if you're talking about organizational performance.
You're talking about log odds, right? Log units?
Oh, not even. No. If we're talking, let's say, I'm just talking about sample size.
Sample size,
so,
yeah.
Yeah. So if we're talking about trying to explain why it is that your company has failed in its China strategy, for example, okay, there's going to be a limited number of metrics that determine, did you meet your China strategy? It'll be around market share. It'll be around margins. It'll, kind of how much geographic area you're covering. Those are all measures that are organization-wide. And in statistical terms, the sample size is 1, right? So you've got one organizational outcome. You got one organizational outcome, and that's the sample size. And the statistical critique is that you can't do any statistics on that, right? You can actually only do statistics when you've got a large number of the same thing repeated. Like if I've got 1,000 salespeople, I can look at differences in performance across those salespeople, and I can do statistics on that. But what the non-statistically trained people don't realize, and this is, what a lot of people in organizations, is that there really isn't statistics you can apply to the most important questions that keep the business leaders up at night. And so when you've got the strategy consultants or even, your own strategy people within your organization, when they're sitting there trying to diagnose and figure out, what's actually, enabling or stopping performance, they're doing what amounts to qualitative analysis. I mean, there's a lot of measures. You can have measures about market share, margins, all that, but they're trying to explain those single outcomes, right? Are we getting the customer service that our strategy says we need to get? And there's about probably 1,000 different variables that they have to consider. And there's no statistics you can do on those 1,000 variables to tell you, are you getting that one outcome, which is customer service? And so it's a type of systems work or logical analysis is what's used, and you get that information by talking to people. I mean, you have to basically paint it's a qualitative kind of case study analysis of what is actually enabling the organizational performance and what is holding it back. And yeah.
So I want to, sorry to interrupt, but I think you're making an important point, but I want to add another insight to this. I agree that when there is, let's say the problem is with the China unit and it's not performing well, it's an N of 1 and you can't do a statistical analysis. This takes us back to what should companies be focusing on? Is it analytics, or is it answering the big question of what could be going wrong? And this is where I think prior evidence could be really beneficial. Strategy academics have been looking at, causes of cross-border failure for a very, very long time. You can look at the 4 or 5 key indicators that you could even go down to the industry level because we have enough data now. You can look at what are the patterns that are associated with failure. And then, go back to what you just said about doing the qualitative analysis. But this time, you're not just looking for the lost key in the dark, but you have a flashlight. You have a flashlight, and that's your prior evidence.
Exactly. So there's so when we say, but I do want to call this analytics. I mean, what I want to do is I want to reclaim the title analytics, and I want to take it away from statistical analysis. It should be in its purest form. It is analysis. But if I go walking into a room, of senior executives having a meeting, and I observe the meeting for 1 minute, I'm doing an analysis, right? I'm immediately, figuring out, who are the people who've got greater positions of power, who are the ones who are, kind of commanding more control in the meeting, who's disinterested, what kinds of side conversations are happening. All of those are critically important for figuring out how effective is that meeting, right? There's no, right, and that in-person observation is a much more efficient and effective way of assessing the health of that meeting and how than any kind of survey I could do, right? So that the point is that there is true organizational diagnostics, true organizational analysis has a lot of different elements, and observational is a really important part of that. Talking to people is a really important part of that. To your point, prior evidence of what do we know about strategies that have succeeded and failed with China, right? What do we know about when we talk about customer service? There's a lot that we know, that, we'd be reinventing the wheel to try to go and just, figure it out looking only at our organization. And so
Right.
I want to reclaim the mantle of analysis and analytics and say it includes all of that and statistical analysis.
Yeah, so qualitative and quantitative. In the good old days, that's what we call them, right? Observations and geofocus groups, even ethnography, just observing and kind of pulling it all together. So I fully agree, and I think that's a really good idea. I don't know if anyone else is talking about this, broadening the concept of what is included under analytics. You talked about measuring what matters. Let's talk just about that. A lot of people will say that most analytics efforts are focused on what's available in the HRIS data, things that can be counted. But even when companies are doing their own surveys, are they truly measuring what matters? Are they measuring things to a point that the inferences they can draw from the results are actually reliable and meaningful?
So I'd say in most cases they're not, but they can. So this is a very classic, and this is what I've learned from, true social scientists, people like you, Shreya, unlike economics, which isn't a real social science.
Well, that's
so
we're both social science. Yeah.
Well, what I'm about to say, though, is what I didn't learn in graduate school, but I learned after coming over and working with the IO psychologists is, for example, when you want to do a survey, the most important thing you start with is interviews. And the reason why you start with interviews is because you need to get a sense about all the different things that are taking place. So, if we're talking about a segment of the organization, like, let's say your distribution system, and we want to understand what's actually, holding back productivity of your distribution system, then there's a lot of possible, causes that are behind that. And I could sit down and try to write a survey to look at all those possible causes. But if I'd write a survey just kind of sitting off in a corner by myself without having talked to anybody in the organization first, that survey is probably going to have to be like 500 questions long, because there's so many kind of, questions and eventualities and different possible things that could be driving behavior and performance that I have to write, way too many survey questions, when if you literally sit down with even just 20 or 30 people who actually work in that system, you can rule a lot of things in and out, right? So you talk to people about, hey, how are things going? What's actually, how are things going well here? What's not? And there's of course, as there's structured interview ways of doing this, where you kind of lead people to different hypotheses. And even then, I wouldn't just sit down and, ask an open-ended questionnaire. I open-ended set of questions. I'd go and talk to, kind of key stakeholders, or kind of the ones who come to us and say, look, we've got a huge issue in our distribution system. They're going to have some prior ideas about what the causes are. So the first step is you take their hypotheses, essentially, their ideas, and you go talk to a bunch of people. And that process of talking to people, you talk to key stakeholders, you talk to people who work in the roles, supervisors, senior management, and you talk to people from top to bottom and across the organization. And it doesn't have to be more than 20, 30, sometimes 40 or 50 interviews. But in the process of doing that, you can rule out a whole lot of possible causes. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you're also you're narrowing down essentially what are the hypotheses you're going to test, what are the kinds of questions you really want to focus in on, and then you design your questions around that. Now, sometimes some of the hypotheses you identify, they're not going to be easy to measure. But by doing that process of interviewing key stakeholders and decision makers in the company, if you've identified, say, 2 or 3 things that are hard to measure. So, for example, goal setting is a really good example that we know from the research literature is critically important for performance. And I've had this happen a lot, where I go in and I'll talk to people and they say, yep, we're just not good at holding people accountable for performance. Well, if by the way, they've already told you that and everybody agrees to it, then you probably even need to measure that in the survey. Right? I mean, if people say, well, I'm not so sure, I think we do hold people accountable for performance, then great. Then I want to put that into a survey and say, rating a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, are people held accountable for performance? Because we can use that to then reach alignment around that. But the solution of how do you get to then better goal setting and performance management, that's much more tricky. And you can't just solve that by doing a survey. And so what I'd say is that when you say kind of what's common practice right now, I'd say there's way too much of, first of all, you just, you do a survey because a vendor has a particular survey, they give it to you, you're trying to do benchmarking against what the other companies are looking at. And I mean, with the first book I wrote, which was called Employee Surveys at Work, I literally advocated that I say, if you don't have a justification for every single question you're running in your annual employee survey right now, you should stop it tomorrow. And simply saying, well, we want to keep trending and seeing what happened, compared to prior years, that's not a good enough reason. I mean, you need to have an actionable thing you want to do with that. And if not, then stop asking those questions. And I want to have you only focus in on questions that come out of this inductive process where we identify what are the key business issues, kind of then talk to key stakeholders and people who are working in that system to understand, what's the reality they're living in. And you learn a lot by just doing those interviews. And then you only resort to a survey to answer the things that require that, where you need to get a lot of consistent measurement across people, and where there's a lot of variation across people that a survey can inform.
Yep. And in the olden days, we called, I feel like old lady now, we used to call that organizational research, right? You're researching your own organization, where now the practice is trending more towards doing these standard surveys. Somebody has, survey on engagement, survey on customer service, and you're just using these standard surveys, which may or may not be informative to the challenges you're having inside the company. I'm going to actually move on from the actual analytics piece to the interpretation part. So while the analytics could produce a lot of good insights, it's not what you do with those insights is not always obvious. And also, the user or the decision maker may not always draw the right conclusions based on the results. And I'll give you an example that I've seen. This is an interpretation fallacy I've seen in many organizations. So a while ago, it was popular to see, the relationship between turnover and leave behaviors, whether or not people are using their vacation days. And one of the common interpretations that I've heard people say is that, well, people who don't take vacation are more likely to leave the organization. So let's try to encourage them to take more vacation. But there is a second variable that may be playing over here, which is that a lot of times if people are considering leaving, then they try to stock up on their vacation days so they have a big payout in the end. So there's this, this is just an example of how it's easy to misinterpret your findings. What are your thoughts on, how can companies make sure that they're interpreting their results accurately?
Well, so you make a great point there, and it all comes back to understanding the people science and the organizational science behind these things. And by the way, let me just again say, organizational behavior and people science is totally founded in IO psychology, which I give full credit for. So I love that example. Let me give you another one to go along with that. So I've come across many instances of kind of people in companies and jobs where they will work extremely hard, and they will be highly committed. Like you said, they might even take less vacation but they are absolutely planning on leaving for whatever the reason is. Now, oftentimes they're leaving because they're not being treated well, or because they want to get that promotion, they're not getting it, or because they've got a really bad supervisor. But both out of personal pride, right? Like, so they like their coworkers, they like the clients, they want the customers to get good products and services. So they have a certain amount of pride. And by the way, if I'm trying to market myself, particularly in a lot of these kind of, higher profile professional jobs where my reputation is really important, I don't want to sabotage anything at the company that I'm working for, even while I might be, looking actively and ready to walk out the door. And in fact, we've seen this where some really high performers, the company has absolutely no idea they're going to leave, and all of a sudden they walk out the door. Well, it's not because they weren't taking their vacation time, right? So if you go to these people and you say, take more vacation time, they'll say, no, I'm really enjoying my job. And even if you make them take vacation time, that they might even leave quicker because now you're like not letting me do my job the right way. Right. And what they're missing is that they're making, this is the data what you're talking about is a perfect example of correlation, not causation, right? So they looked at the data, they say, people who take vacation are less likely to leave, but the causal variable is not taking vacation, right? The causal variable is some kind of other thing, it's some kind of affect that the person has. how they feel about the company and how they're deciding to orient their, kind of structure their time and are they taking vacation or not. There's a much more complicated calculus that's going on there. And what that company is missing that you were working with is they weren't taking a step back and saying, what is the actual motivation that's going on here? Kind of what is the step-by-step process that people, how are they deciding? Because there's lots of things that go into this. So how are they deciding, do I like working here? Number one, is the work, is the work really valuable? Do I like doing it? And then what are all the other attributes of the job and attributes of the career working there? That's what they're looking at. They're solving people are solving this highly complex, multidimensional problem. And anytime we reduce it down to, I'm just going to look at two different variables and try to say, oh, well, taking vacation predicts turnover, that's way too simplistic data mining and totally mistaking, correlation for causation.
You used a key term here, that they're trying to solve a multidimensional problem, but trying to reduce it down to two variables. And it's amazing how it happens so often. I mean, the number of 2x2 matrices that I see in companies, everything is boiled down to, can you put it on a 2x2? And if that makes sense, then everybody can rally around it. But what the need of the hour is to treat these complex problems as complex and not try to reduce it down to two variables that, our minds can handle.
Right. Well, and so I'm going to agree with that. I'm going to say two polar opposite things at the same time. So the first is that, so anytime a survey is run, if I never again see any 2x2 comparisons, it'll be too soon. Like there's no argument ever doing 2x2 comparisons for two survey items that are essentially attitudinal measures, because there's always this much more complex process going on. And the fact that there's now such depth of IO psychology expertise, both in the survey consulting companies and sitting within organizations, everything should be done through multivariate modeling when we're talking about looking at essentially like employee engagement and motivation. So that's one thing in favor of what you said. Now, something that goes entirely opposite that is, back when I was in graduate school, I was taught by some very smart econometricians, and one of the things that I was taught, and this was a way of critiquing these highly complex models, is if somebody runs a really complicated statistical model and they come up with a relationship that you look at and go, okay, I understand that seems to be, a statistically significant relationship, but it doesn't make sense. Anything you find through a complicated modeling process, you should be able to, first of all, tie back to a story that makes sense, and even better, there actually is a way to report a data of, essentially a 2x2, which is a bunch of means, two different characteristics. We'll look at the mean responses or mean, characteristics of people according to those two variables. You should be able to show a version of that complicated multivariate story in a 2x2, but only after you've done the complicated analysis, right? So first you build the model, you decide what you're going to test, you let the complicated analysis tell you what looks like the important relationship, but then you should always be able to go back into looking at kind of comparing, different groups subgroups within the data, and then see that 2x2. But I only get to the 2x2 after doing the complicated analysis. I don't start there and don't go any further.
No, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about the structure of HR analytics. We've talked about, how do we analyze the data? Who should analyze it? How do you interpret it? But let's go back to this question of what's the best, in order to enable the team that's doing the analytics, trying to make sense of it, in order for them to create the most value, where should they sit? Should they sit as part of the business analytics team? Should they be a separate team within HR, or should they be embedded within the different HR teams?
So I think that embedding an HR analytics team within a business analytics team is usually not a good idea, because they need to be equals with each other. So I don't want to have the HR analytics people reporting into a business analytics lead if that business analytics lead doesn't understand the people side very well. There is a challenge about, do you have all the expertise you need in an HR analytics team to do analytics the right way? And the answer is you don't. But I'm not talking about data science skills here. I'm talking about kind of knowledge of the business. And so if you have an HR analytics team, there always is going to be a business analytics team, because you always build a business analytics team first before you do HR analytics. And what I want from an organization design standpoint is I want to be creating those two as being kind of co-equals in the organization chart and for answering important questions. So I want to require that any time a business analytics team wants to do any kind of analysis about why we're getting performance the way we are, that they can't do that only by looking at the business side of the equation. They have to look at the people side as well, and vice versa. So I don't want an HR analytics team that can only look at the people side without tying into the business side. You need to actually have them be integrated and working hand in glove, but it doesn't mean they have to be reporting into the exact same, kind of senior manager or senior executive. By the same token, there are kind of the more advanced statistical and org diagnostic skills that it doesn't make sense to embed those kind of side by side with the HR business partners sitting out, in the business, because you'd be overpaying, essentially building way too much of that capacity in where you don't need it. So I definitely want, as long as the business is large enough you can actually support an analytics team, then I want to have the most advanced skills be in the COE, in the Center of Expertise. But at the same time, I want to be building analytics expertise within the HR business partners. So this doesn't mean that the HR business partner has to have an analytics person reporting into her, but it does mean that she needs to be savvy enough that she can actually define the questions to be asked, knows what kind of data is out there to answer it, can then go and engage with an analytics expert around, if there's specific types of analysis has to be done, they can do that. But then they have to also own the interpretation and the work back with the people, in the business. My colleague, Alexis Fink, who I do a lot of partnering with around this, she has a really great, I think it's like a 7-step model, or it's a 7 types of things you do when doing HR analytics. And like the first 4 steps, the first 2 steps and the last 2 steps are ones that are actually best done by HR business partners, which is what I was just talking about. And so the middle 3 steps that are truly done by kind of the more pure data scientists or kind of data geeks. And so when we talk about building an HR analytics expertise, it's building the more kind of, statistically, sophisticated skills in a center group, but then making sure you've got statistical savvy amongst your HR business partners, or else you're not going to get to effective execution of what you want.
Got it. Excellent point. Alex, this has been really useful. I'm sure we can talk many more hours about how to advance HR analytics. We've covered a lot of ground today, talking about how to structure an analytics team, how to staff analytics team, what techniques to use, etc. So if we could wrap this all up, and let's say that you're talking to a CHRO or the head of talent or the chief learning officer or even the head of analytics, what advice do you have for them that you think will give them the biggest bang for their buck?
So I would say is again to think about, always focus on the business picture. So my colleague John Boudreau has talked a lot in the past about kind of 3 different measures of is HR actually working the way it's supposed to? And there's efficiency, effectiveness, and impact. Efficiency is essentially cost of delivery. Effectiveness is, are we getting the HR outcomes out that we want? So for example, if we're doing performance management, are we actually differentiating performance in our performance rating? So that's an example of effectiveness. But impact is the hardest one to show. And by impact, I don't want to just talk about ROI, because ROI is often a measure of impact on cash flow. And I can impact cash flow by cutting cost, essentially.
Right.
And that kind of narrow measure of ROI is not what we want. We want to know, are we actually helping the business to execute the strategy in the way that it needs? And whether you're sitting in an HR analytics role, or you're sitting in an HR business partner role, I don't care if you're sitting, deep in the comp and ben, in a function, that your job as an HR professional has to be to help the business to improve its performance. Now, we can do that by improving employee engagement in some cases. We can do it by improving learning and development in other cases. We can do it by improving, career progression in other cases. But But you have to do kind of take Dave Ulrich's advice really seriously, because he talks a lot about HR takes way too much of an inside-out approach, which is we're looking at, what are our current, programs and policies we have in place, and can we find some way to justify them to show that we're doing the right thing? And that is totally putting the cart before the horse, right? I mean, we know, I know, we've seen so many companies where the biggest problem is the silos that sit within the HR function, right? So people, I'm in Comp and Ben, and so I've got my Comp and Ben hammer, and everything I look for is a nail that I want to use that hammer on. Or I'm in leadership development, I've got my screwdriver, and everything I look for is a screw that I can use that on. And in fact, if the HR function were to take much more of a holistic view of saying, anytime someone from the business comes to us with a problem, that our job is to take a big step back and say, first of all, what is the business context here? What is the problem they're trying to solve? And, no, I'm not being strategic if a senior leader comes to me and says, oh, I figured this out, we just need to tweak compensation, and then that'll improve performance. I don't care if that's like the best request you've ever gotten as a comp professional. You should run as far away as possible from that kind of a request, because it's pretty much guaranteed that senior leader has made a big mistake in her diagnosis. And what you need to do is engage in a process of saying, that's really great, I'm so glad you brought this to the table. Tell me more about why it is, that's the problem. And then basically become the organizational psychologist, who puts them on the organizational couch and says, well, tell me more about that, and probe deeper and really get at the deep underlying business questions. Because at the end of the day, and again, I'll just kind of, give a flavor towards this, so people can go look it up more. I have this in my book and others, but there's this old model that comes out of the research literature. It's called the capability, opportunity, motivation model. And basically, opportunity is the same thing like job design. I just put those words on it in my book, and I don't claim this is, my model. It's been around for a long time. The basic problem we have in HR is that HR is allowed to focus on motivation, like motivation, engagement, things like that. That's all the attitudinal things. HR is also allowed to focus on competencies or capability. What are the knowledge, skills, and abilities, competency models, all that. HR is never allowed, or is rarely ever invited to the table to focus on job design. And yet, every time I know you with your clients, when companies come to us at the, at Center for Effective Organizations, and they say, can you help us out with this problem in terms of motivation or productivity? There's always something about the way the job is designed, or a way that the team is designed, or the larger business process, or even the organization design. And what HR doesn't do enough of is looking at that bigger picture and saying, what are those structural things, the way the job is designed, the way the team is designed, the way the end-to-end business process is designed? That's where a huge amount of problems with kind of motivation, behavior, and performance come from. And we don't do enough of that holistic systems view. And so whether you're an HR business partner or, or someone who's sitting in the analytics role, that's what we all need to be doing more of.
That is actually really powerful. And I was thinking, wow, that could be a podcast by itself. How do you address requests from the business? And, the most important thing, everything you said is really, really important. It's our experience as well, that when business makes a request, don't just run and to deliver on that. Because then you're just in a service role. No one's going to come to you for any strategic advice. They just come to you because you're the gopher. But more importantly, if business had the same insight that you have as an expert, they wouldn't need you. The issue is that the business leaders don't have the skills or the ability to figure out what is really going wrong. And that's where HR can help. If they are the experts on people, that's what HR can help with.
Exactly.
But that's not what most HR professionals are doing today.
No, sadly it's not.
Well, so much more to talk about, but I know our time has come to an end, and I'm very, very grateful for sharing your wisdom with our audience. And I'm looking forward to our next conversation. I'd love to have you back for another podcast.
Well, thank you, Shri, and thank you for giving us this great platform for being able to come in and share. It's a real treat, and we all thank you for this.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much, and thank you on behalf of our audience and behalf of the HCG team. That's it, listeners. That was our Exponential Talent podcast on HR analytics with Dr. Alec Levenson. One of the key takeaways for me was the significance of having functional knowledge to get the most out of your analytics effort. A lot of companies fuss about the right technology to house the data or doing fancy algorithms. Where I think they can get more value based on what Dr. Levenson shared with us is by focusing on asking the right questions that has relevance to the present business conditions. Also, most often, it's the simple statistical techniques that are needed to drive actionable insights instead of doing fancy analytics like machine learning. If your company has been looking for better approaches and how to improve their talent analytics effort, hopefully you got some guidance here. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe. Until the next time, goodbye from your host, Shreya Sarkar-Barney.